The previews featured on video rentals, even those rated for G or PG audiences, aren't necessarily appropriate for all viewers. In fact, most movie previews contain violent or sexually suggestive scenes, even on movies marketed specifically to young viewers. We'll find out more. Let's take note with Mary Beth Oliver. She's an associate professor of communications and co-director of the Media Effects Laboratory at Penn State. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You looked at 107 movie previews that are featured on video rentals. Give us an idea of the movies that you looked at and what you found on them.
Well, we took a random sample of videos to get these trailers, and by far most of the films that are out are R-rated. So I would say about half of the trailers that we looked at were R-rated, and very few actually are G. They ranged from some children's films to action-adventure, romantic comedy, so they pretty much spanned the genres.
What's interesting is that most of the titles available for parents to rent are, as you said, R-rated, and yet it's not as if the movie industry doesn't expect young people to watch them.
Oh, that's right. I mean, I think that would be something, of course, that would be denied. But the FTC recently in 2000 looked at the kinds of marketing tactics that are used, and certainly younger audiences are a target audience.
In fact, you point out in your study that the cost of movie making has increased by 400% in the last 15 years, and that the general rule of thumb is that 66% of the cost of movie making is allotted for promotions and marketing. With that much at stake, they obviously know what they're doing, and what I find especially interesting and disturbing as well is the fact that the R-rated movies have toys and video games that are absolutely targeted to young kids.
Oh, absolutely. That's the case. There's an incredible amount of cross-promotion that goes on in the industry. And when you think about trailers in particular, you have to keep in mind that there's 2 minutes, you know, approximately, to attract an audience. And so typically what they're trying to do is cram as much excitement into those 2 minutes as possible to attract the viewer's attention.
Now, of those 107 previews or movie trailers that you looked at, some of them were G and PG. Did that make much difference in terms of the content of the previewed movies? In other words, did those trailers contain violence even though they knew the movie that was on there was for young kids?
They absolutely did, and that was one of the main points that we wanted to make. About 2/3 of the films, the previews for films that were G or PG rated, contained at least one act of aggression. Now, the rate of aggression was slightly higher in PG-13 and R-rated films, but nevertheless, still, previews for children, the majority of them did contain violence. Sexuality, however, was much lower in films that were marketed toward children.
Which is interesting because the message there seems to be that it's okay to market violence to children, but sexual content may somehow be harmful.
I think that is a value system that is very curious at best, and I say that because if you look at the literature on how viewers are affected by various forms, various types of content, there's not a whole lot of evidence that sexual content, sexual innuendo, has a strong negative effect, but there's a wealth of research on the negative effects of violence.
In fact, 30 years, almost every major public health organization, the American Medical Association, the American Pediatrics Academy, all of those organizations have come out saying that there absolutely is a link between watching aggressive material and aggression or violence in society.
Oh, that's right. And increases in aggression that's just one type of harmful effect. There are hosts of others, including desensitization, including greater fear of being victimized, for example. So certainly increasing aggressive behavior is one harmful effect, but there are others.
There was a recent op-ed piece. It was written by Nancy Carlson Page, And in this piece, she explains why The Bourne Identity, an R-rated film that starred her son Matt Damon, she said it really should have been, I'm sorry, it was PG-13, and she said it really should have been rated R instead. And she really brought to the forefront this whole idea, something that a lot of people talk about today, which is ratings creep. Something that might have been rated R 5-10 years ago is now acceptable as a PG-13. What's happening?
I've been thinking about this quite a bit because you see more and more extreme sorts of content, not just in films but on television, extreme sports, extreme games, fear factor, etc. And I really do think that that this sort of intensification of violence or greater acceptance of violence is a result of desensitization. That is, it's with any sort of behavior, if we're exposed to it over and over again, eventually it doesn't result in the same sort of arousal. And so what happens is we find it not as troublesome, but also what happens is that we are drawn toward more and more extreme sorts of content to experience the same level of arousal.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I was just reading in the New York Times an article about all of the lawsuits that are resulting from these reality extreme programs that are on the air, where people, while they signed releases, they were literally hurt physically or psychologically from doing some of the things they did, and really addressing what you just said, pushing the envelope. Back, the very first motion picture was The Great Train Robbery, 11-minute film. It's regarded as the first film. And in it, there's a scene where a cowboy holds a pistol and aims it directly at the camera. And the very first audiences who saw that literally screamed and ran out of the theaters. And I'm wondering what it would take to get any audiences today to do that same thing.
I am at a loss, because especially in light of the reality programming of anything, seeing real people suffer real injury should be disturbing to viewers, and yet it seems to be extremely popular. So I really don't know what it would take.
But the good news there is that it may not be as inexpensive to create those reality TV programs because of the lawsuits that are resulting.
Well, you know, actually, the whole genre of reality programming, from Fear Factors and shows like that to Cops, and these programs are incredibly cheap. And I also think that it's important to recognize that their popularity probably does reflect how inexpensive typically it is to shoot these, in addition to viewers' attraction to that time.
Now, most people in Hollywood are mute on this whole subject of violence. In fact, the argument usually is my movies reflect what's going on, they don't make what's going on. But there was at least one writer, William Mastrosimone, who was the writer of Extremities and The Beast and The Burning Season, a number of other films. And he says, if conscience is not part of our product, then we are no different than the cigarette companies who lied for decades that there is no cause and effect between smoke and cancer. What do you think it will take, and how important will it be for Hollywood to acknowledge that the product that they're selling, especially if it's geared to kids, can be harmful?
I don't think that they're ever going to acknowledge it, to be honest with you, because we have to recognize that this is a money-making industry here. I think really ultimately what's going to have to happen is that we as a society recognize the importance of teaching ourselves and our children critical viewing skills as a way of inoculating ourselves against these harmful influences. But I don't think that that's something that the industry is going to take up.
And in fact, you advise parents to watch or to preview the previews before they give their kids the video.
I certainly do, because just because a video that a parent rents is G-rated does not mean that the trailers that precede the film are devoid of violence. And so a parent may feel that he or she is being responsible in selecting content appropriate for the child, and yet lo and behold, here's a trailer and it's filled with violence, or it shows guns.
Do they pack more punch because that violence is condensed, as you said, into just 2 minutes?
I think so. You know, just now we are starting to look at how viewers respond to the violence and how that affects viewers' anticipated enjoyment and desire to view the film. And we are finding that violence does have an effect. It's not a direct effect. In other words, just including violence doesn't seem to make people want to view it, but indirectly, if it increases anticipated suspense or action. But there are other ways to increase suspense and action other than violence, and I think that it would be a wonderful world if the movie industry would consider alternate ways of doing that.
The writer of Extremities also said that kids today are the most exploited generation in history, not in body but in mind and spirit. And he says that we will be known to history as the sellout generation. Hollywood will stand for the Roman Colosseum, a horror chamber where endless ways of killing were invented to please packed audiences, and we will come to foretell the fall of an empire. Just your reaction to that?
I think probably every generation has thought that to a certain extent, so I kind of take it with a grain of salt, although when I look at the landscape of literature showing the harmful effects of violence and just the sheer prevalence of violence, I think that we may well look back and wonder, what have we done?
Mm-hmm. But do you expect it's going to get worse?
Well, if you look at how much violence there has been in television over the years, it's remarkably stable, just the rate. But I do think maybe the nature of it will change. And it's important to recognize that violence isn't violence. How it's portrayed matters a great deal. So I don't know that we'll see a greater increase in the rate. I don't see how it would be possible, frankly, but how it's portrayed.
For instance, the violence in Saving Private Ryan, well, you'd have to say there's violence in that film that certainly is different than watching Freddy Krueger kill somebody in Friday the 13th.
Absolutely. Schindler's List, for example, is very violent. And so it's important to recognize that showing violence as rewarded, as heroic, as performed by these wonderful like characters, that's what we really need to focus on.
Some people say that what really needs to happen is what happened in the tobacco industry, where the public finally acknowledged and the industry finally acknowledged that they were selling a product that was harmful, and class action suits followed and the government action followed. Do you see a similar scenario possibly ever taking place within the movie industry?
Possibly. Of course, that's going to have to be motivated by viewer concern. And one thing that's interesting is that we as viewers tend to want to deny that we're affected. Everyone else is affected, but I'm not affected, for example. And so I think that it may be a longer time coming for people to recognize how they themselves are affected, and then put pressure on the industry.
Okay, thanks so much for being with us.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.